Readers are welcome to leave comments in the comments section.
The digital thermometer on the wall of the Twin Palms estate read 89 degrees. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but the Palm Springs sun was already an aggressive, physical weight pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The air conditioning had given out an hour ago with a pathetic metallic shudder, leaving the mid-century modern house to bake in the Coachella Valley heat. The production assistants had fled to the nearest hardware store in Cathedral City to find portable fans, and the styling team had retreated to a nearby diner, claiming they needed to preserve the silk garments from the humidity of human bodies. Which left Harper Vance and Quinn Gallagher entirely alone. Harper stood by the kitchen island, tracing the rim of a sweating highball glass filled with melting ice. She wore a tailored linen suit in a muted bone color, a garment designed for air-conditioned boardrooms in Manhattan, not the suffocating stillness of the California desert. She kept her spine perfectly straight, refusing to lean against the marble counter. Harper Vance did not wilt. She was the art director for this campaign, and wilting was not on the schedule. Across the open-plan living room, Quinn was moving. Quinn was always moving. The photographer had abandoned her denim overshirt hours ago, stripping down to a ribbed white tank top that clung to her ribs. She was currently crouched near a C-stand, adjusting the angle of an amber gel over a strobe light. A thin sheen of sweat made her collarbones gleam in the harsh afternoon light. Her dark hair was gathered into a messy knot at the nape of her neck, secured by a silver hair stick she had casually pulled from her pocket. Harper watched the flex of muscles in Quinn's shoulders as she hoisted a sandbag onto the base of the stand. It was infuriating how comfortable Quinn looked in the heat. It was infuriating how comfortable Quinn looked anywhere. "The light's going to peak in about 20 minutes, Quinn said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She always seemed to know exactly where Harper was in a room. "The talent won't be back for at least 40, Harper replied, her tone crisp. She took a sip of the ice water. The ice clinked against the glass, a sharp sound that echoed off the terrazzo floors. "We are behind schedule." Quinn finally turned, wiping her palms on the thighs of her dark, paint-splattered jeans. She walked toward the kitchen. Her boots made no sound against the floor. She moved with a fluid, lazy grace that Harper found deeply disruptive to her own need for order. "We aren't behind," Quinn said, stopping on the opposite side of the kitchen island. She reached out and took Harper's glass. Harper's breath hitched in her throat, a microscopic betraying movement she prayed Quinn missed. Quinn didn't ask for permission. She simply slid the glass from Harper's fingers, her knuckles brushing against Harper's skin for a fraction of a second. The contrast between Quinn's calloused fingertips and Harper's manicured hands was a sudden, electric shock. Quinn lifted the glass to her lips, turning it exactly half an inch so her mouth covered the exact spot where Harper's lipstick had left a faint, peach-colored smudge. She drank the remaining water in 3 long swallows. Harper stared at the column of Quinn's throat. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands to keep them steady. "There is bottled water in the cooler." "Too warm," Quinn said, setting the empty glass down between them. A single drop of water escaped her lips, tracing a line down her chin before she caught it with the back of her thumb. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel that shifted depending on the light, locked onto Harper's. "Besides, I don't mind sharing." The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a guitar string tuned too high. Harper refused to look away. She was used to managing eccentric creatives, used to steering massive egos with a velvet glove. But Quinn was a different entirely. Quinn didn't want to be managed. Quinn wanted to test the boundaries of the cage until the bars bent. "I need to check the exposure on the couch," Quinn said, breaking the gaze first. She gestured toward the sunken living room, where a massive, circular emerald velvet sofa dominated the space. It was the centerpiece of the campaign. "I need a body to pull focus." "Use a light meter," Harper countered, crossing her arms over her chest. The linen of her jacket felt heavy. "I did. Now I need to see how the fabric absorbs the light around a human shape." "Skin tones bounce differently than gray cards, Vance. You know that." Harper did know that. She also knew that stepping out from behind the safety of the kitchen island meant stepping into Quinn's territory. The camera was Quinn's domain. "Just sit for 2 minutes, Quinn challenged, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "Unless you're afraid the heat might finally melt your armor." Harper's jaw tightened. Without a word, she uncrossed her arms, walked around the island, and descended the 2 shallow steps into the sunken living room. The emerald velvet felt thick and warm beneath her hands as she sat down on the edge of the cushions. She arranged her legs at a precise angle, rested her hands in her lap, and squared her shoulders. Quinn stood behind the tripod, peering down at the medium format camera. She turned a dial, the mechanical click sounding unnaturally loud. "You look like you're bracing for a root canal," Quinn murmured, her voice muffled behind the camera body. "I am sitting." "You're posing." "Badly." Quinn lifted her head, stepping away from the tripod. "This campaign is supposed to be about languid luxury. A Sunday morning in the desert. You look like you're about to fire someone." "I am an art director, not a model," Harper said, her tone sharp. "If you need someone to drape themselves over the furniture, wait for the talent. I don't need you to be the talent. I need you to be human." Quinn walked over. She didn't stop at the edge of the sofa. She stepped between Harper's knees, invading her personal space so completely that Harper could smell the faint scent of cedarwood, dust, and something inherently, dangerously Quinn. Harper froze. She looked up. Quinn was tall, forcing Harper to tilt her head back. The sunlight filtering through the slatted wooden ceiling cast a pattern of horizontal shadows across Quinn's face, making her look predatory. "What are you doing?" Harper's voice was lower than she intended. The authoritative edge had vanished, replaced by a sudden, shallow breathlessness. "Fixing the shot," Quinn said quietly. Quinn reached out. She didn't hesitate, but her movements were slow, deliberate. Her left hand hovered for a second before her fingers settled on Harper's right shoulder. The heat of Quinn's palm bled straight through the linen jacket. Harper's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told herself to pull away, to stand up, to remind Quinn of their professional boundaries. But her body refused to obey the commands of her brain. She remained entirely still, trapped by the intensity in Quinn's hazel eyes. "Drop this shoulder," Quinn commanded softly. She applied a gentle pressure. Harper yielded, her posture loosening a fraction of an inch. Quinn's hand slid from Harper's shoulder, tracing the lapel of the jacket until it reached the collar. "You're too buttoned up." Before Harper could protest, Quinn's fingers brushed against the sensitive skin at the base of Harper's neck. A shiver wrecked through Harper's spine, entirely at odds with the stifling heat of the room. Quinn's thumb grazed the hollow of Harper's throat, lingering just long enough to feel the erratic, racing pulse jumping beneath the skin. Quinn's eyes darkened. She noticed. Of course she noticed. "Take the jacket off," Quinn said. It wasn't a request. "I prefer to keep it on." The fabric is creating a rigid silhouette. It throws off the shadow. Quinn's hand remained at Harper's collar. She leaned in closer. Her voice dropped to a register that vibrated straight through Harper's chest. "Take it off, Harper." It was the first time in 3 days Quinn had used her first name. It sounded like a dare. Harper held Quinn's gaze. Slowly, maintaining unbroken eye contact, Harper reached up and unbuttoned the single tortoiseshell button of the linen jacket. She shrugged it off her shoulders, letting it pull on the velvet beside her. Underneath, she wore a simple, silk camisole in a deep ivory. The air in the room suddenly felt thinner. Quinn's gaze dropped to Harper's bare shoulders, tracking the line of her collarbones, before slowly rising back to her eyes. The smirk was gone. The casual, teasing arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something heavy and focused. "Lean back," Quinn instructed, her voice tight. Harper obeyed. She sank back into the plush emerald velvet, the material swallowing her silhouette. Quinn didn't step away immediately. She stood there, looking down at Harper, the distance between them practically non-existent. Harper could feel the heat radiating from Quinn's body. She could see the tiny pulse beating at Quinn's temple. If Harper tilted her chin up just an inch, if she leaned forward just a fraction, their lips would brush. The impulse was terrifying. It was a physical ache, a sudden, desperate urge to close the remaining distance and find out if Quinn tasted like the ice water she had just stolen. Quinn swallowed hard. She stepped back, breaking the invisible tether that held them together. The absence of her heat left Harper feeling instantly exposed. Quinn retreated to the tripod. She ducked her head behind the camera, hiding her face. Harper took a deep breath, trying to force her heart rate back to a normal rhythm. She arranged her hands loosely in her lap, letting her head rest against the back of the sofa. "Look at the window," Quinn's voice came from behind the camera. It sounded steady, professional again. The armor was back in place. Harper turned her head toward the massive panes of glass, staring out at the jagged peaks of the San Jacinto Mountains. The glare was blinding. "Good. Hold that." The mechanical clack of the shutter echoed in the quiet room. "Now look at the floor. Let your eyes drop. Don't move your chin." Clack. "Now," Quinn said, her voice dropping lower again. "Look at me." Harper turned her head. She didn't look at the lens. She looked directly over the top of the camera body, locking eyes with Quinn. The lens was a barrier, but it offered no real protection. Being observed by Quinn was a visceral experience. Harper felt stripped bare, every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself dismantled by a single, focused gaze. "Part your lips." "Just a little," Quinn murmured. Harper's breath caught. She parted her lips, drawing in a shaky breath of the stagnant, cedar-scented air. Clack. Quinn didn't immediately advance the film. She stayed frozen behind the camera, staring at Harper over the top of the viewfinder. "Got the shot?" Harper asked, fighting to keep her voice level. "Yeah," Quinn breathed out. She slowly straightened up, resting her hand on the metal frame of the camera. "I got it." Neither of them moved. The heat in the room was no longer just a product of the broken air conditioning. It was something they had generated, a sudden, contained fire burning in the space between the tripod and the velvet sofa. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside shattered the silence. The crew was back. The spell broke. Quinn immediately turned away, busying herself with the dials on the light meter, her movements suddenly jerky and rushed. Harper sat up. She grabbed her linen jacket and pulled it on, wrapping the heavy fabric around herself like a shield. She buttoned it with trembling fingers, smoothing down the lapels, erasing any trace of the vulnerability that had just consumed her. By the time the front door swung open and the chaotic chatter of the styling team filled the entryway, Harper Vance was standing by the kitchen island again, perfectly composed, tracing the rim of an empty glass. But as she looked across the room, she caught Quinn staring at her. The photographer quickly averted her eyes, but Harper had seen it. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had simply been bottled up, waiting for the next moment they were alone. And looking at the tight grip Quinn had on the metal C-stand, Harper knew that neither of them was going to survive the rest of this shoot unscathed. The invasion of the production crew transformed the stifling stillness of the Twin Palms estate into a chaotic hive of noise. Industrial portable fans were hauled through the glass doors, their thick yellow cords snaking across the terrazzo floors. The metal blades offered a deafening, continuous roar, pushing the hot, stagnant desert air around the room without actually cooling it. A styling assistant steamed silk garments in the hallway, adding damp humidity to the oppressive atmosphere. Harper retreated to the periphery. She anchored herself behind the kitchen island, gripping a clipboard. The physical barrier helped ground her racing pulse. She watched a makeup artist dab powder onto Chloe, a 19-year-old model who looked engineered specifically for high-fashion editorials. Chloe was beautiful, pliable, and vacant. Quinn, meanwhile, was in her element. The lazy stillness that had trapped Harper vanished completely. Surrounded by her crew, Quinn was kinetic energy. She barked spatial coordinates over the fans, directing assistants to reposition the amber gels. She did not look at Harper. It was a deliberate, pointed omission. "Let's get Chloe on the couch," Quinn yelled, waving toward the sunken living room. Harper watched the model descend the shallow steps, her movements heavily rehearsed. Chloe wore a draped slip dress in pale sage green. She arranged herself on the emerald velvet, crossing her legs against the cushions. She looked immaculate, yet entirely like a plastic mannequin. Quinn stood behind the camera, her eye pressed to the viewfinder. "Drop your left shoulder, Chloe. Look toward the window. Give me something bored. You are rich, you are hiding out in Palm Springs, and you have absolutely nothing to do today." The shutter began its rhythmic, mechanical clicking. Quinn moved with the tripod, shifting angles, offering a stream of low murmurs. "Yeah, that's it. Hold the chin. Breathe through your mouth. Softer." Harper gripped the clipboard. The instructions were practically identical to the ones Quinn had murmured 20 minutes prior. "Part your lips. Just a little." Harper felt a spike of heat radiate at the base of her neck. She told herself it was solely the ambient temperature. "Hold," Harper said. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp and unyielding. Quinn lowered the camera. She did not turn around, but her shoulders went rigid. "We are losing the natural light, Vance." "What is it?" "The posture is wrong," Harper said, stepping out from behind the island. She walked toward the living room, her block heels clicking sharply. "The campaign is languid luxury, not a furniture catalogue." "She looks incredibly stiff." A collective hush fell over the crew. Arguing with a photographer during golden hour was a risk, but Harper operated entirely by her own demanding standards. Harper stepped down into the living room, ignoring Quinn as she focused on the bewildered model. "Chloe, you are perching. You need to sink into the furniture." Let the velvet support your actual weight. I don't want to wrinkle the silk, Chloe murmured nervously. I do not care about the silk, Harper stated flatly. She leaned over the sofa. Look. Harper reached out, adjusting the drape of the fabric across Chloe's knee. She then moved to Chloe's shoulder, pressing down lightly. Release this tension. Let your collarbone drop naturally. As she adjusted the model, Harper felt a prickle of awareness travel up her spine. She didn't need to turn her head to know Quinn was watching her. The tactile focus of Quinn's gaze was unmistakable. It felt like a physical pressure resting against Harper's skin, tracking the line of her back and the precise movements of her hands. Harper kept her expression completely blank, maintaining a facade of clinical professionalism while her blood hummed. Better, Harper declared, stepping back. She turned to face Quinn head-on. Shoot that. Quinn stared at her for a long, silent second. The hazel of her eyes appeared darker in the dimming afternoon light. She didn't argue. She simply brought the camera back to her face. You heard the art director, Chloe. Sink into it. The rapid clicking of the mechanical shutter resumed immediately, but the underlying atmosphere in the expansive room had irreversibly shifted. The crew moved with a nervous, hurried energy, sensing the high-voltage wire strung taut between the two women. Every instruction Harper gave, every adjustment she demanded, was met with a clipped, precise response from Quinn. It was a masterclass in professional hostility, a flawless performance designed to mask the fact that they were hyper-aware of each other's breathing. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the San Jacinto Mountains, painting the desert sky in bruised shades of violet and orange, they had enough variations. Cut, Quinn announced, stepping away from the tripod. Tether the camera. I want to review the raw files before we lose daylight completely. The digital technician had set up a viewing station in the corner of the adjacent dining room. A heavy black pop-up tent covered the laptop to eliminate screen glare, creating a dark, enclosed space barely large enough for two people. Harper walked over to the digital tether station, lifting the black fabric flap. She ducked inside. The air in the enclosure was stifling, heated by the exhaust fan of the heavy-duty laptop processing massive image files. A moment later, the fabric rustled, and Quinn stepped in beside her. The space was drastically too small. Their shoulders brushed. Quinn smelled of cedarwood, hot canvas, and the faint, salty tang of dried sweat. Harper stiffened, clasping her hands tightly in front of her to prevent them from trembling. Pull up the last sequence, Quinn instructed the technician, who sat just outside the tent operating the external keyboard. The bright glow of the laptop screen illuminated the cramped space, casting sharp, angular shadows across Quinn's face. Harper kept her eyes fixed firmly on the monitor. The high-resolution images of Chloe flashed across the screen. They were technically perfect. The lighting was flawless, the colors were rich, and the composition was exact. But they were entirely lifeless. Next, Quinn murmured, her voice a low rumble vibrating in the tight space. Her bare arm grazed the linen sleeve of Harper's jacket. Harper did not step away. She couldn't. There was nowhere left to retreat. Next. The images clicked past in rapid succession. Chloe looking left. Chloe looking right. She is empty, Harper whispered, the words slipping out almost to herself. I can only capture what is currently there, Quinn replied softly. She turned her head, looking at Harper instead of the bright screen. Her breath brushed against Harper's cheek in the dark. I am a photographer, Vance. not a magician. Keep scrolling, Harper ordered the technician, her voice shaking by a microscopic fraction. She needed to focus on the screen. She needed to stop thinking about how effortless it would be to turn her head and close the 2 inches of space between them. The technician tapped the arrow key rapidly, flying backward through the timeline of the afternoon shoot. Past the final shots of Chloe. Past the empty frames used for lighting tests and exposure checks. And then, the screen stopped entirely. Harper stopped breathing. The image on the glowing monitor filled the dark tent. It was the test shot. Harper sat on the emerald velvet, swallowed by the rich fabric. Her linen jacket was discarded beside her on the cushions. The ivory silk camisole exposed the sharp lines of her collarbones. But it was her face that commanded the frame. Her lips were slightly parted, capturing a ragged intake of breath. Her eyes were locked directly onto the lens, dark and dilated, stripped of every corporate defense she possessed. It was an image of absolute, terrifying vulnerability, charged with an undeniable, raw hunger that Harper spent her entire life trying to suppress. The silence in the viewing tent was absolute. The mechanical roar of the portable fans outside faded into a distant, irrelevant drone. Harper stared at her own face, a pulse hammering violently against her ribs. The woman on the screen did not look like an art director running a campaign. She looked like someone waiting to be touched. "Delete it," Harper commanded. Her voice was a ragged, breathless whisper. Quinn did not move. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Harper, staring at the glowing screen. "No. I said, delete the file, Quinn." Harper finally turned her head. Quinn met her gaze. In the dim, artificial blue light of the monitor, the remaining physical distance between them completely evaporated. Quinn's eyes were entirely dark, reflecting the glowing screen, and neither of them made a single move to step back into the safety of the light outside. "No," Quinn repeated, the single syllable falling like a heavy stone in the suffocating air of the tether tent. Harper's fingernails bit harshly into the leather binding of her clipboard, leaving deep, permanent half-moon indentations in the material. Her breathing felt restricted, as if the oxygen in the cramped enclosure had been suddenly vacuumed out. "It is an unauthorized image. It does not belong in the campaign drive, and it certainly does not belong in the client deliverables." "It's on my personal SD card," Quinn replied, her voice dropping into a register that felt incredibly, dangerously private. "Which means it belongs entirely to me. I am not deleting it." The artificial blue light of the monitor caught the sharp, uncompromising angle of Quinn's jaw as she reached past Harper to access the keyboard. As she moved, the bare skin of her forearm brushed against Harper's ribcage. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but it sent a violent spike of heat straight through the layers of Harper's silk camisole and heavy linen jacket. Quinn tapped the spacebar with a decisive click. The screen blinked rapidly, moving past the terrifyingly vulnerable exposure of Harper's face, replacing it with a sterile, overlit test shot of the empty emerald velvet couch. The raw evidence was hidden from view, but the after-image burned brightly behind Harper's eyelids, seared into her retinas. Harper took a slow, deliberate breath, constructing her corporate armor piece by piece in the dark. She stepped backward, shoving the heavy black canvas of the tent aside with unnecessary force. The immediate assault of the industrial portable fans and the chaotic chatter of the styling crew felt like a physical blow, grounding her back in reality. She did not look back to see if Quinn followed her out of the shadows. "Wrap it up," Harper announced to the expansive room, her voice a perfectly calibrated instrument of absolute authority. She walked briskly toward the kitchen island, picking up her production schedule. We have lost the natural light completely. Pack the silk garments carefully. I want everything inventoried and sent back to the agency by tomorrow noon. Nobody leaves until the equipment is fully secured. The following hour was a masterclass in calculated avoidance. Harper directed the strike down of the elaborate set from the safety of the kitchen counter, communicating with Quinn exclusively through the first photography assistant. She watched from a safe distance as Quinn systematically broke down the heavy medium format camera. The photographer's movements were efficient, practiced, and fluid, snapping expensive lenses into heavily padded Pelican cases with definitive, satisfying clicks. Not once did Quinn look up toward the kitchen. The drive down Highway 111 toward downtown Palm Springs offered Harper a temporary, desperately needed reprieve. She drove her rented sleek black sedan in absolute silence, the air conditioning finally fully functional, blasting frigid air directly against her flushed face. Outside the tinted windows, the massive white windmills of the San Gorgonio Pass stood stark against the darkening sky, their colossal blades turning in slow, hypnotic rotations against a backdrop of bruised purple and violent orange clouds. Harper gripped the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. She could still feel the phantom weight of Quinn's calloused hand resting on her bare shoulder. She could still vividly see the dark, hungry look in Quinn's hazel eyes illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen. She told herself it was merely a lapse in judgment. It was a biological byproduct of heat exhaustion and dehydration. It was a statistical anomaly that Harper Vance, a woman who built her entire career on flawless precision, would swiftly and brutally correct. By 8 o'clock, the production crew had commandeered a massive, rough-hewn wooden table on the outdoor patio of the Ace Hotel's restaurant. Festoon string lights were draped carelessly across the corrugated tin roof overhead, casting a warm, flickering amber glow over the mismatched vintage chairs and the sprawling spread of flatbreads, roasted vegetables, and towering pitchers of iced margaritas. The punishing desert heat had finally broken, replaced by a dry, cooling breeze that rustled the massive fronds of the surrounding palm trees. Harper sat at the absolute head of the long table, sipping a gin martini that was bone-dry and impeccably cold. She maintained a rigid posture of polite detachment, nodding mechanically as the styling director complained incessantly about the desert humidity's catastrophic effect on natural silk fibers. She contributed exactly nothing to the conversation, offering only the thinnest veneer of professional courtesy. At the far opposite end of the table, Quinn was effortlessly holding court. She had retreated to her room briefly to shower, changing into a clean, oversized black t-shirt that hung loosely off her shoulders. Her dark, damp hair was pushed back from her face, curling slightly at the ends. She was laughing deeply at an anecdote the digital technician was telling, leaning back in her wooden chair with a casual, sprawling confidence that took up entirely too much space. Yet, despite her apparent engagement with the crew, every few minutes, Quinn's gaze would inevitably drift down the length of the table. She made absolutely no effort to hide it. She would lock eyes with Harper through the dense thicket of empty glassware, half-eaten plates, and moving hands. The moment their eyes met, the casual smile would instantly vanish from Quinn's face, replaced by an expression of intense, unwavering focus. It was a silent, persistent tug on an invisible tether they both acutely knew existed. Harper took another sharp, measured sip of her gin. The clear alcohol burned pleasantly down her throat, but it did absolutely nothing to dull the frantic hyper-awareness humming fiercely beneath her skin. When Quinn leaned forward suddenly to reach for a heavy glass pitcher of water, the wide neckline of her black shirt dipped significantly, revealing the sharp, shadowed line of her collarbone and the faint, pale scar resting just above it. Harper abruptly set her martini glass down on the wooden table. The sharp glass clink was entirely drowned out by the surrounding ambient noise, but Harper felt the physical impact rattle in her own teeth. "Excuse me for a moment," Harper murmured to the stylist mid-sentence. She stood up gracefully, smoothing out the non-existent wrinkles from her linen trousers. She needed air that didn't heavily smell of roasted garlic, mezcal, and Quinn's lingering, unavoidable presence. She navigated away from the crowded, noisy patio, stepping off the wooden deck and walking steadily toward the hotel's expansive pool area. It was largely deserted at this late hour, the majority of the guests having retreated to the indoor bars or their private rooms. The massive, rectangular swimming pool glowed with deep, underwater LED lights, casting rippling, aquamarine reflections onto the surrounding white canvas cabanas and the geometric concrete walls. Harper walked to the far, secluded edge of the water, stepping intentionally into the deep, cooling shadows cast by a massive, spiked agave plant. She opened her metallic clutch and retrieved a slim, vintage silver cigarette case. She did not smoke frequently. It was a hazardous vice reserved strictly for rare moments when her meticulously ordered, carefully curated world threatened to tilt violently off its axis. She placed a thin white cigarette between her lips, pulling out a matching silver lighter. She dug her thumb into the striking wheel. It sparked weakly, but completely failed to catch a flame. She tried again, striking the wheel with a frustrated, jerky motion. Another useless, momentary spark. "You're flooding the flint." Harper's entire body froze. She did not need to turn around to recognize the low, gravelly timbre of that voice. Quinn stepped out from the deep shadows of a nearby canvas cabana, moving with that same infuriating, silent grace that made her seem like she was gliding rather than walking. The aquamarine light reflecting from the pool water illuminated the lower half of her face, highlighting the faint, arrogant smirk playing at the very corner of her mouth. "I was entirely unaware you were an expert on mechanical engineering alongside your other photographic talents," Harper said, keeping her voice incredibly flat and devoid of any welcome. She lowered her silver lighter but stubbornly kept the unlit cigarette resting between her lips. "I'm highly observant," Quinn replied simply, taking a slow step forward. She closed the physical distance between them with deliberate, predatory pacing. Out here by the pool, there were no cameras, no lighting assistants, and no velvet couches to act as professional buffers. There was just the quiet, rhythmic lapping of the chlorinated pool water and the vast, empty expanse of the dark desert sky above them. Quinn reached into the front pocket of her dark denim jeans and pulled out a battered, scratched brass Zippo lighter. She flipped the metal lid open with a sharp, echoing clack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet courtyard. She struck the flint wheel in one fluid, practiced motion. A tall, steady yellow flame immediately erupted, cutting through the darkness. Quinn took one final step directly into Harper's personal space. She did not hand the brass lighter over. Instead, she held the flame up exactly between them, forcing Harper to lean forward if she wanted the light. Harper hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The flickering yellow flame illuminated the narrow space between their faces, casting shifting, dancing shadows over the bridge of Quinn's nose and the depth of her hazel eyes. Refusing to take the light would be an obvious retreat. Harper Vance fundamentally did not retreat. She tilted her head forward, slowly lowering her face toward Quinn's hand. As she drew the heat in, the tip of her cigarette finally catching and glowing a fierce, bright red, her eyes flicked upward through her lashes. Quinn was not looking at the cigarette. Quinn was staring intently, obsessively, at Harper's mouth. Harper stepped back instantly, exhaling a long, shaky plume of pale grey smoke into the cool night air to mask her unsteady breathing. "Thank you. You've been actively ignoring me all night," Quinn noted quietly. She snapped the brass Zippo shut with a loud click and slipped it back into her pocket. She leaned casually against the low concrete wall bordering the deep end of the pool, crossing her bare arms over her chest. "I have been managing a production crew of 15 people who were severely behind our established schedule," Harper corrected, holding the cigarette carefully between her manicured fingers. "I do not have the time or the luxury for casual socializing." Socializing? Is that what we were doing in the viewing tent? The heavy question hung suspended in the air, blunt and unyielding. Harper took another deep, grounding drag of her cigarette, letting the harsh nicotine coat her lungs and steady her fraying nerves. "We were reviewing the day's professional work. Or attempting to, before you decided to blatantly breach agency protocol." "Protocol," Quinn scoffed softly, shaking her head as a dark curl fell across her forehead. "You deliberately use these massive, sterile corporate words to build a fortress around yourself. You actually think if you sound exactly like an HR manual, nobody will notice that you are practically vibrating out of your own skin." "I am perfectly calm, Quinn." Quinn pushed heavily off the concrete wall. She took a step toward Harper. Then another. Harper held her ground, locking her knees, fiercely refusing to back away even a single inch as Quinn boldly encroached on the invisible boundary line she had drawn. "You were terrified," Quinn stated, her voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper. She stopped less than a foot away. The distinct, intoxicating scent of dry cedarwood mixed sharply with the chemical smell of chlorine in the incredibly narrow space between them. "When you saw that photograph on the screen, you were utterly terrified because for exactly one fraction of a second, you actually let somebody look past the armor. You let me see you." "It was a meaningless trick of the ambient light," Harper countered, her voice vibrating with a dangerously tight, defensive edge. "It was an unapproved, mistaken exposure. It meant absolutely nothing. You can lie to the agency executives, Vance. You can lie to the client until you're blue in the face." Quinn leaned in even closer, tilting her head slightly. Her eyes were piercing, searching every micro-expression on Harper's face with ruthless, forensic precision. "But do not ever lie to the person holding the camera. I know exactly what I saw through that lens." Harper's heart hammered violently against her ribs, a deafening echo of the frantic, out-of-control rhythm from the living room earlier that afternoon. She looked directly at Quinn's mouth, at the sharp, stubborn curve of her jawline, and felt a sudden, terrifyingly overwhelming urge to bridge the final, agonizing gap between them. She wanted to grab the thin cotton collar of Quinn's ridiculous black t-shirt and pull her in fiercely, just to completely silence the arrogant, infuriating certainty in the photographer's voice. Instead, utilizing every single ounce of willpower she possessed, Harper took a final drag of the cigarette. The red ember glowed fiercely in the dark space between them. She dropped it deliberately onto the stone pavers and crushed it completely beneath the sharp heel of her leather shoe. "You saw an artifact, Quinn." "A technical mistake," Harper stated, forcing her tone to remain devoid of any recognizable human emotion. She looked up, meeting Quinn's intense gaze with a chilling, perfectly manufactured emptiness. "And I strongly suggest you learn how to delete your mistakes before they become a permanent liability." Harper did not wait for a single word of response. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her footsteps clicking in a fast, rhythmic cadence against the stone pathway. She physically felt Quinn's eyes burning intensely into her spine with every single step she took toward the safety of the brightly lit restaurant. The conversation was officially over, but as Harper stepped back into the noisy crowd, she knew with terrifying certainty that the war of attrition between them had undeniably just begun. The relentless morning sun of the Coachella Valley had already begun to bleach the sky a blinding, pale blue by the time Harper Vance walked into Kings Highway. The Ace Hotel's diner, a repurposed roadside Denny's with elephant-patterned wallpaper and tufted leather booths, hummed with the low, hungover energy of a departing production crew. Harper selected a corner booth facing the door. She wore a sharply tailored navy silk blouse, completely buttoned to the collar, and her hair was secured in a severe, immaculate French twist. She was actively rebuilding the fortress. She opened her silver laptop, ordered a black espresso, and began typing out a mercilessly detailed post-production schedule. The rhythmic, aggressive clacking of her manicured fingernails against the keyboard was a physical manifestation of her need for absolute order. She did not look up when the brass bell above the diner door jingled, but she felt the atmospheric shift immediately. Quinn walked in. She was wearing faded, ripped Levi's and a vintage white t-shirt tucked loosely into her waistband, a pair of dark Ray-Ban aviators shielding her eyes. She carried a battered leather duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She paused at the entrance, scanning the crowded diner. Her head turned, locking onto the corner booth with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Harper deliberately kept her eyes fixed on the glowing spreadsheet. She typed faster. The leather bench opposite Harper groaned as Quinn dropped her duffel bag onto the floor and slid into the booth. The small wooden table offered virtually no barrier. Quinn did not ask for an invitation. She simply reached across the laminate surface, picked up Harper's ceramic espresso cup, and took a slow sip. Too bitter, Quinn noted, setting the tiny cup back down exactly on its matching saucer. She pushed her aviators up, resting them on the crown of her messy hair, revealing eyes that were alarmingly sharp for 7 in the morning. Harper finally stopped typing. She rested her hands flat on the aluminum chassis of the laptop. I am currently working, Quinn. There are empty tables in the back. I like this one, Quinn replied lazily. She leaned back, stretching her long legs under the table until the toe of her heavy leather boot lightly bumped against the sharp heel of Harper's pump. Harper immediately pulled her feet back, her spine stiffening. Quinn's lips twitched in a faint, knowing curve. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans and pulled out a small, unsealed manila envelope. She tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed directly on top of Harper's printed call sheet. What is this? Harper asked, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. A peace offering, Quinn said. Or a declaration of war. Depends entirely on how you want to look at it. Harper stared at the thick paper of the envelope. Her pulse, which she had spent 2 hours attempting to regulate with deep breathing and cold showers, immediately began to race. Slowly, projecting a bored indifference she absolutely did not feel, she picked up the envelope and tipped it over. A single piece of heavy-stock photographic paper slid out onto the table. It was the test shot. The image from the tethered tent monitor, fully realized in high-definition print. The deep emerald green of the velvet, the stark ivory of the silk camisole, and the devastating, unmasked hunger in Harper's own dilated eyes. Holding the physical object felt entirely different from seeing it on a transient screen. It felt permanent. It felt dangerously real. I had the digital tech run a proof on the portable printer last night, Quinn murmured. The teasing lilt was gone from her voice, replaced by a quiet, grounding gravity. I told you I don't delete my work. But I also don't hold hostages. It's the only physical copy. The raw file is securely locked in an encrypted drive that goes straight to my personal vault. Nobody at the agency will ever see it. Harper stared at the photograph. Her fingers hovered over the glossy surface, afraid to actually touch the evidence of her own unraveling. Why are you giving this to me? Because you need control, Quinn said simply. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, invading Harper's space once again. You need to hold it in your hands to prove to yourself that you can contain it. So, contain it, Vance. Tear it up. Burn it with that cheap silver lighter you can't even operate properly. Do whatever you need to do to convince yourself that yesterday afternoon didn't happen. Harper's jaw tightened. She carefully slipped the photograph back into the manila envelope and slid it into the interior pocket of her leather briefcase. She snapped the brass clasps shut with a sharp, definitive click. Your psychological evaluations are wildly inaccurate. I am returning to Los Angeles. I require the final edits delivered by Thursday. She closed her laptop, grabbed her briefcase, and stood up, sliding smoothly out of the booth. She did not wait for Quinn's response. She walked out of the diner, the harsh morning heat hitting her like a physical wall the moment she pushed through the glass doors. Harper walked briskly across the asphalt parking lot toward her rented sleek black Audi. She needed the sanctuary of the heavily tinted windows and the isolating silence of the freeway. She slid into the leather driver's seat, tossed her briefcase onto the passenger side, and pressed the push-to-start button. The dashboard flickered weakly. A pathetic, hollow clicking sound echoed from the engine block. The engine did not turn over. Harper frowned. She pressed the brake pedal harder and pushed the button again. Click, click, click. The battery was entirely dead. She glanced at the overhead console. The small reading light switch was pushed in. Someone, likely the incompetent valet last night, had left the interior light on, draining the battery completely in the punishing desert climate. Harper gripped the steering wheel, letting out a sharp, frustrated breath. She had an in-person briefing with the creative director in West Hollywood at 2 o'clock. Waiting for roadside assistance in Palm Springs would take a minimum of 3 hours. A heavy, rumbling engine roared to life a few yards away. Harper turned her head. Quinn was sitting behind the wheel of a restored 1978 Ford Bronco, painted a matte, dusty black. The heavy off-road tires crunched over the gravel as she backed out of a parking space and rolled slowly toward Harper's stalled Audi. Quinn rolled down the heavy glass window, resting her bare, tanned arm against the metal frame. Dead battery? Quinn asked, looking entirely too amused. A temporary inconvenience, Harper stated through the open door, refusing to step out of the useless vehicle. I am calling a service truck. It's a Sunday morning in the desert, Vance. A tow truck will get here right around the time the sun burns out, Quinn pointed out practically. She reached over and pushed the heavy passenger door of the Bronco open. It swung wide with a metallic creak. Get in. I'm heading straight back to the Silver Lake studio. I'll drop you off at the agency. Harper stared at the open door of the truck. The interior was utilitarian, all black vinyl and exposed metal, smelling faintly of gasoline, old leather, and cedarwood. It was a chaotic, unrefined machine. It was the absolute last place on earth she wanted to be trapped for a 2-hour drive. I cannot arrive at a corporate meeting in a vehicle that looks like it survived a post-apocalyptic war, Harper said, her tone rigid. Suit yourself, Quinn said, shifting the heavy gear stick. Enjoy the heat stroke. She began to ease her foot off the clutch. Wait. The word tore out of Harper's throat before she could stop it. She checked her silver wristwatch. She had absolutely no other viable option, and she violently hated being cornered. Moving with stiff, reluctant grace, Harper grabbed her leather briefcase, locked the dead Audi, and climbed up into the high cab of the Bronco. She shut the heavy door, the sound echoing with a solid, definitive thud that felt distinctly like a trap springing shut. "Seatbelt," Quinn instructed, not looking over as she steered the large truck out of the Ace Hotel lot and merged onto East Palm Canyon Drive. Harper pulled the heavy canvas strap across her chest, clicking it into place. The truck lacked the smooth, insulated suspension of her rental car. She felt every single bump in the asphalt, the vibrations traveling up through the floorboards directly into her spine. The air conditioning was practically non-existent, forcing Quinn to keep both windows completely rolled down. The rushing desert wind immediately began tearing at the pristine structure of Harper's French twist, pulling loose strands of hair across her face. They merged onto Interstate 10 West, the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert opening up on either side of the asphalt ribbon. The massive white windmills spun lazily in the distance. The cab of the truck was incredibly narrow. There was no expansive console dividing the two seats, just the exposed metal gear stick protruding from the floor. Every time Quinn shifted gears to navigate the sloping inclines of the highway, her knuckles brushed dangerously close to the side of Harper's knee. It happened the first time they hit a steep grade near Cabazon. Quinn pushed the clutch in, wrapping her long fingers around the worn leather knob of the gear stick, and pulled it down firmly. The back of her hand grazed the navy silk of Harper's trousers. Harper's breath hitched, her leg instantly locking up. She shifted closer to the passenger door, pressing her shoulder against the hot glass, desperately trying to create a millimeter of physical distance. Quinn didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge the contact. But 5 miles later, when traffic slowed near the Banning Pass, she had to downshift. She pushed the stick forward, and this time, the side of her palm rested deliberately against Harper's knee for a full, agonizing second before she pulled her hand back to the steering wheel. The heat inside the cab was no longer just the California sun. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Harper stared straight ahead at the blinding highway, her hands clutching the leather handle of her briefcase in her lap like a physical shield. The manila envelope inside felt like a radioactive core burning through the layers of material. "You're awfully quiet over there, Vance," Quinn practically shouted over the deafening roar of the wind and the rattling engine. "I have nothing to say to you," Harper yelled back, refusing to turn her head. "That's fine," Quinn smiled, resting her elbow on the open window frame, letting the harsh wind whip her dark hair into a messy frenzy. "We have 100 miles to go. You don't have to say a word." Quinn shifted gears again. Her hand dropped, her fingers brushing the sensitive curve of Harper's calf just below the hem of her trousers. Harper closed her eyes, her pulse hammering relentlessly against her throat. The highway stretched out endlessly before them, a brutal strip of burning asphalt, and Harper knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that she was not going to survive this drive with her armor intact. The Interstate 10 West is a brutal, unforgiving stretch of asphalt that dissects the California desert. Inside the cabin of the 1978 Ford Bronco, the environment was arguably worse. The harsh, hot wind whipped aggressively through the open windows, violently tearing at the severe structure of Harper's French twist. Stray strands of dark hair whipped across her cheekbones, stinging her skin. She kept her eyes fixed rigidly on the dashboard, refusing to acknowledge the physical reality of the narrow space she was currently trapped in. Every incline on the highway required Quinn to downshift. Every single time she reached for the heavy metal gear stick protruding from the floorboards, her knuckles deliberately brushed against the side of Harper's left knee. It was a slow, methodical torture. The first time, Harper flinched, pulling her leg sharply toward the passenger door, pressing her shoulder into the hot glass. The second time, as they climbed the San Gorgonio Pass, Quinn's fingers dragged lightly across the navy silk of Harper's trousers, the rough calluses catching slightly on the fine material. Harper's breath hitched audibly, her hands tightening into tight fists in her lap. She glared straight ahead at the massive white windmills spinning in the distance, her jaw locked. The third time, as traffic slowed near the Whitewater exit, Quinn shifted into second gear and simply left her hand resting there. Her palm rested lightly on the gear knob, but the side of her hand was pressed flush against the sensitive inner curve of Harper's calf. The ambient heat radiating from the exposed metal transmission tunnel was nothing compared to the searing, localized fire of Quinn's skin against hers. Harper did not pull away. She could not pull away. Her muscles had entirely locked up, paralyzed by a devastating combination of absolute outrage and a sudden, paralyzing surge of adrenaline. The vibration of the rumbling engine transferred directly through Quinn's hand into Harper's leg, a low, continuous frequency that settled heavily at the base of her spine. "You are crossing the center line," Harper said, her voice strained and unnaturally tight, desperate to break the suffocating silence in the cab. Quinn did not move her hand. She merely adjusted her grip on the steering wheel with her left hand, her hazel eyes flicking briefly to the rearview mirror. "Wind is pushing the suspension. It's a heavy truck, Vance. It drifts." Harper swallowed hard. The air in the cab felt dangerously thin. She opened her metallic clutch, pulled out her phone, and tapped the dark screen. She needed an anchor. She needed the sterile, unemotional text of a corporate email to ground her rapidly fraying nerves. She opened her inbox, staring blankly at a message from the agency's creative director regarding the afternoon meeting in West Hollywood. The words blurred together, a meaningless jumble of black text on a glaring white background. Outside the window, the sky began to change. The blinding, pale blue of the desert morning suddenly shifted to a bruised, sickly yellow. "Put the phone away," Quinn ordered, her voice suddenly losing its lazy, teasing edge. She finally pulled her hand away from the gear stick, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. "I am reviewing the client brief," Harper replied stubbornly, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Look out the window, Harper. I said put the damn phone away." Harper raised her head. A massive, towering wall of swirling brown dust was rapidly rolling across the desert floor, swallowing the windmills whole. It was a localized haboob, a violent dust storm born from the shifting pressure systems of the valley. The wind speed doubled in an instant, howling aggressively against the metal chassis of the truck. Loose gravel and sand began to pelt the windshield like a shower of tiny bullets. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet in a matter of seconds. "Hold on," Quinn grunted, pressing the clutch down and wrestling the heavy steering wheel to the right. She muscled the Bronco off the highway, taking the cab as an exit entirely by blind memory. Through the thick, swirling brown haze, the colossal, eerie silhouette of the famous concrete Tyrannosaurus Rex loomed overhead, a bizarre monument in the middle of a chaotic storm. Quinn drove past the diner and violently swung the truck behind an abandoned, graffiti-covered gas station, parking the heavy vehicle flush against the concrete wall to shield it from the worst of the abrasive wind. She immediately reached out and grabbed the manual window crank on her side, rolling the heavy glass up. "Roll yours up. Now." Harper dropped her phone into her lap and grabbed the metal handle, frantically turning it until the passenger window sealed shut with a heavy thud. The instant the windows were closed, the deafening roar of the wind was abruptly muted, reduced to a hollow, aggressive moaning against the exterior metal. But the sudden loss of airflow had an immediate, catastrophic consequence. The cab of the Bronco instantly transformed into a sealed greenhouse. The California sun, though obscured by the thick dust, continued to bake the black metal roof. The heat radiating from the engine block seeped through the floorboards. Harper sat frozen in the passenger seat, her chest heaving. The silence inside the insulated cab was deafening. The only sound was the harsh, rapid cadence of their synchronized breathing. Quinn turned the key, killing the engine. The resulting stillness was incredibly heavy. Harper reached for her phone again with trembling fingers. She tapped the screen, blindly attempting to reopen her email application. Her hands were shaking so severely she dropped the device. It clattered against the metal floorboard, sliding near Quinn's heavy leather boot. Harper reached down, but Quinn moved faster. Quinn scooped the phone up from the floor. She did not hand it back. Instead, she leaned forward and dropped the device onto the far edge of the dusty dashboard, completely out of Harper's reach. "I need that," Harper said, her voice a ragged, breathless whisper. She pressed her spine hard against the vinyl seat, trying to create distance. "No, you don't." Quinn unbuckled her canvas seatbelt. The metallic click echoed loudly in the small space. She shifted her body, turning fully to face Harper. She pulled her right knee up onto the seat, closing the physical gap between them entirely. The wide console of the truck was non-existent. There was absolutely nothing separating them now. "Quinn." Harper's voice wavered, a devastating betrayal of the strict control she fought so hard to maintain. She clutched the handle of her leather briefcase tightly against her chest, a useless, pathetic shield. "You are hiding again," Quinn murmured softly, leaning in. The scent of cedarwood, hot canvas, and the faint metallic tang of the impending storm filled Harper's senses, intoxicating and overwhelmingly present. "You're trying to build another wall. But there's nowhere left to retreat, Vance. We are stuck here until the dust settles." "I am not hiding," Harper lied, her chin tilting up defensively. "I am attempting to salvage a ruined schedule. I have a meeting in West Hollywood in 3 hours, and I am trapped in a broken-down relic in a parking lot." Quinn smiled. It was not a teasing smile. It was slow, dark, and dangerously knowing. She reached out. Harper stopped breathing entirely. Quinn's hand hovered in the suffocating air for a fraction of a second before her fingers gently touched the side of Harper's neck. The contrast was shocking. Quinn's skin was cool from the evaporating sweat, while Harper felt like she was burning alive from the inside out. Quinn's thumb brushed lightly against the erratic, frantic pulse beating wildly just beneath the surface of Harper's skin. "You are terrified," Quinn whispered, her hazel eyes locking onto Harper's with an intensity that physically pinned her to the seat. "I am uncomfortable," Harper corrected, her voice trembling. She refused to break eye contact. To look away would be to admit absolute defeat. "The temperature in this vehicle is unsafe." "It has absolutely nothing to do with the temperature, and you know it." Quinn's hand slid upward, her fingertips tracing the sharp, elegant line of Harper's jaw. The touch was incredibly light, yet it carried a devastating weight. It dismantled every corporate defense, every icy glare, and every carefully constructed boundary Harper had ever built. A single bead of sweat rolled down Harper's temple. Quinn caught it with the pad of her thumb, wiping it away with an agonizingly slow, deliberate motion. Harper's eyes fluttered shut against her own will. The sensation of Quinn's calloused fingers against her overheated skin was a dangerous, addictive relief. A soft, involuntary sigh escaped her parted lips. That microscopic surrender completely shattered the remaining tension in the cab. Quinn leaned closer. The physical space between them collapsed to less than an inch. Harper could feel the heat radiating from Quinn's body, could feel the incredibly shallow, uneven breaths brushing against her own lips. Harper opened her eyes. Quinn's face was entirely blurred by proximity. The arrogant photographer was gone, replaced by someone intensely focused, entirely consumed by the exact same terrifying gravity that was pulling Harper apart. Without thinking, driven by a raw, primal instinct that bypassed logic entirely, Harper reached out. Her hand did not push Quinn away. Instead, her manicured fingers gripped the loose fabric of Quinn's vintage white t-shirt, bunching the cotton tightly in her fist. She pulled. It was a fraction of an inch, a subtle, desperate demand to close the final, agonizing gap. Quinn groaned softly, a low, guttural sound that vibrated deeply in her chest. She shifted her weight, leaning her entire body toward Harper, trapping her perfectly between the heavy passenger door and her own unyielding presence. Quinn's left hand came up, tangling fiercely in the loose strands of Harper's hair, her thumb pressing firmly against the delicate shell of Harper's ear. Outside, the wind battered the metal chassis of the truck, howling in the darkness of the dust storm. But inside the cab, time had completely stopped. Harper tilted her head up, her lips parting, the absolute certainty of the collision hanging heavily in the suffocating heat. She could practically taste the salt on Quinn's skin. She could feel the erratic thumping of Quinn's heart mirroring her own frantic rhythm. The control was entirely gone, surrendered to the storm and the woman cornering her in the dark. The physical distance between them had completely evaporated. The suffocating heat of the sealed Bronco cab pressed down on them, heavy and absolute, but Harper could no longer feel the oppressive ambient temperature. Her entire sensory world had collapsed down to the exact point where Quinn's calloused thumb rested against her jawline. Outside, the haboob raged, violently battering the metal chassis of the truck with a relentless assault of sand and grit. Inside, the silence was deafening. Harper kept her fingers fiercely tangled in the soft, worn cotton of Quinn's vintage t-shirt. It was a desperate anchor. She could feel the rapid, uneven rise and fall of Quinn's chest against her knuckles. Quinn tilted her head, her dark hair falling forward, casting a deep shadow over her eyes. Her breath washed over Harper's lips, tasting faintly of black coffee and the raw, electric static of the storm. Every single self-preservation instinct Harper possessed screamed at her to pull away, to rebuild the fortress, to assert her authority. Instead, her grip on the cotton tightened. She leaned up, entirely surrendering to the overwhelming, terrifying gravity that had been pulling at her since the first moment she stepped into the desert. Her eyelashes fluttered shut. She waited for the impact. A sharp, synthetic marimba melody suddenly pierced the heavy air. The jarring corporate ringtone echoed off the metal roof of the cab, obnoxiously loud and completely out of place. It was coming from the dusty dashboard. Harper's phone was vibrating violently against the cracked plastic, the screen lighting up to display the name of the agency's executive creative director. The sound was a bucket of freezing water. It shattered the primal, isolated bubble they had built. Harper's eyes snapped open, The vulnerability in her chest instantly hardened into raw, absolute panic. She let go of Quinn's shirt as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. She shoved her hands flat against Quinn's shoulders, pushing the photographer backward with a sudden, frantic burst of strength. Quinn stumbled back, hitting her spine against the driver's side door. The heavy metal rattled under the impact. Harper scrambled backward, pressing herself flat against the passenger window. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving as she stared at Quinn in absolute horror. She wasn't horrified by Quinn. She was horrified by her own complete loss of control. Quinn did not immediately move. She stayed pressed against the opposite door, her hazel eyes completely dark, locked onto Harper. The muscle in Quinn's jaw feathered as she clenched her teeth. She looked at Harper's mouth, then slowly raised her gaze to meet Harper's panicked eyes. The phone continued to ring on the dashboard, a relentless demand from the reality Harper had briefly abandoned. "Answer it," Quinn said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was a low, harsh rasp, completely stripped of its usual lazy arrogance. Harper reached forward with a violently trembling hand and snatched the device off the dashboard. She swiped the green icon, bringing the cold glass to her ear. She turned her head, staring blankly out the window at the swirling brown dust. "Vance," Harper said. She hated how breathless she sounded. She cleared her throat sharply, forcing her posture rigid. "Yes, David. I apologize for the delay. We encountered a localized dust storm on the interstate. I am currently en route to the West Hollywood office. The presentation will commence exactly at 2. Quinn watched her. Harper could feel the heavy weight of that gaze boring directly into the side of her neck. Harper disconnected the call, dropping the phone carefully back into her metallic clutch. She reached up with both hands, mechanically smoothing down the stray hairs that had escaped her French twist, forcefully pinning them back into place. She adjusted the collar of her navy silk blouse, erasing the wrinkles she had just created. "The storm is passing," Harper stated to the glass window, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. It was true. The howling wind had dropped to a dull moan, and the thick brown haze outside was beginning to thin, revealing the blinding, harsh sunlight of the desert noon. Quinn stared at Harper for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The heavy engine roared back to life, shaking the entire chassis. Quinn shifted the truck into gear and pulled roughly out of the abandoned gas station lot, merging back onto the highway without checking for oncoming traffic. The remaining 90 minutes of the drive to Los Angeles passed in absolute, suffocating silence. Harper kept her body angled toward the passenger window. She did not look at the gear stick. She did not look at Quinn's hands. She watched the brutal desert landscape slowly transition into the sprawling, concrete suburban grid of the Inland Empire, and finally, into the dense, chaotic traffic of the 101 freeway. The physical distance between them in the cab remained agonizingly small, but the emotional chasm was now vast and unbridgeable. By the time the heavy Ford Bronco pulled up to the polished glass facade of the agency's West Hollywood headquarters, the oppressive desert heat had been entirely replaced by the cool, marine layer of the Los Angeles basin. Harper unbuckled her seatbelt before the truck had fully stopped in the loading zone. She grabbed her leather briefcase, clutching it fiercely against her chest. "The deliverables are expected in the main boardroom on the 4th floor, Harper said sharply, finally looking at Quinn. Her corporate mask was completely secured. There was no trace of the woman who had unbuttoned her jacket on the velvet couch, or the woman who had grabbed Quinn's shirt in the storm. Do not be late. Quinn rested her forearms on the steering wheel, looking up at the towering glass building. She didn't look at Harper. I'll be there, Vance. Harper stepped out of the truck, slamming the heavy metal door shut. She walked briskly through the revolving glass doors of the agency, entirely ignoring the valet who offered to assist her. The interior of the building was a sterile sanctuary. Polished concrete floors, stark white walls, and a massive central atrium that smelled of expensive espresso and cold, filtered air. Harper rode the glass elevator to the 4th floor, allowing the aggressive air conditioning to freeze the lingering desert heat right out of her bones. At exactly 2 o'clock, Harper stood at the head of the massive, custom-built mahogany table in the executive boardroom. The room was immaculate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Hollywood Hills. 6 agency executives, including David, the executive creative director, sat around the table, sipping iced sparkling water from crystal tumblers. Harper commanded the room with effortless, lethal precision. She wore her authority like a tailored suit. She projected the preliminary mood boards onto the massive flat screen, speaking rapidly and confidently about brand identity, target demographics, and visual continuity. She was completely in her element, utilizing her precise vocabulary to build an impenetrable fortress of professionalism. The core objective was to capture the inherent languid luxury of the product, Harper explained, tapping her silver pen against the leather binder on the table. We utilized natural desert light to create a specific, aspirational atmosphere. The model's posture and the structural staging were entirely built around the concept of effortless wealth. The heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. The room fell entirely silent. Quinn walked in. The contrast was staggering. In a room full of expensive Italian suits and designer dresses, Quinn looked like a feral predator that had just wandered into a sterile laboratory. She had changed her shirt, now wearing a crisp, black button-down, but the sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, exposing the sun-darkened skin of her forearms and the faint, pale scar near her wrist. Her dark hair was still messy, curling slightly at the ends from the desert humidity. She carried a sleek, silver hard drive in one hand. She walked with that same infuriating, fluid grace, ignoring the executives entirely. She walked straight to the opposite end of the long mahogany table, pulling out the empty ergonomic chair directly across from Harper. Quinn sat down. She tossed the silver hard drive onto the polished wood. It slid exactly to the center of the table. "Sorry I'm late," Quinn said. Her voice carried easily across the large room, low and rough. She leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked directly at Harper. Traffic on Santa Monica was a nightmare. Harper felt a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline pierce through her carefully constructed calm. The physical distance between them was now over 15 feet of solid wood, but under Quinn's unwavering gaze, it felt like they were still trapped in the sweltering cab of the Bronco. "Miss Gallagher," David said smoothly, breaking the tension. Harper was just walking us through the conceptual framework. We are eager to see if the raw selects align with the agency's vision. The selects are exactly what the desert provided, Quinn replied, never taking her eyes off Harper. Harper tightened her grip on her silver pen until the metal dug painfully into her skin. She forced her facial muscles to remain completely neutral. "Please load the files onto the presentation drive, Quinn." Quinn smirked. It was a microscopic shift, a private challenge broadcast across a public space. She leaned forward, plugging the hard drive into the table's interface. The massive screen behind Harper flickered. The mood boards vanished, replaced by the high-resolution images of Chloe, the model, draped across the emerald velvet sofa. As you can see, Harper smoothly pivoted, gesturing toward the screen without turning her back to Quinn. The lighting captures the texture of the silk perfectly. The brand identity is front and center. It's a beautiful shot, David agreed, nodding slowly. But it feels static. A bit cold. Harper's jaw tightened. She prepared to defend her direction, to explain the nuances of high-fashion editorial staging. She was cold, Quinn interrupted smoothly. Her voice echoed in the quiet room. The model was following instructions perfectly. She was sitting exactly where she was told, breathing exactly how she was told. It creates a flawless image, but it doesn't create heat. Harper froze. She stared at Quinn. The double meaning in Quinn's words was a blatant, reckless weapon, wielded openly in front of the entire executive board. "And how do we capture heat, Miss Gallagher?" David asked, clearly intrigued by the photographer's sudden input. Quinn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. She locked eyes with Harper. The memory of the dust storm, the suffocating heat, and the desperate grip on a cotton shirt hung heavily in the air between them. "You don't stage heat," Quinn said softly, her hazel eyes completely dark. "You capture it when the subject stops trying to control the environment and finally surrenders to it. You capture the moment the armor drops." Harper stopped breathing entirely. The boardroom, the executives, the client deliverables, it all faded into background noise. There was only Quinn, sitting at the end of the table, methodically tearing down the walls Harper had spent her entire life building, brick by carefully laid brick. The silence in the executive boardroom stretched, pulling taut until it threatened to snap. Harper Vance did not flinch. She did not break eye contact with the photographer sitting at the opposite end of the massive mahogany table. She took a slow, meticulously measured breath, drawing the frigid, heavily filtered air of the corporate building deep into her lungs. The raw, suffocating panic that had entirely seized her chest inside the cab of the Bronco was gone, replaced by the familiar, icy clarity of professional survival. Harper was the art director. This was her domain. "An intriguing philosophical perspective on portraiture, Miss Gallagher," Harper stated. Her voice was smooth, polished, and utterly devoid of any recognizable tremor. She deliberately turned her attention away from Quinn, addressing David directly. "However, we are not producing an independent art exhibit in a downtown gallery. We are selling a heritage silk collection to a demographic that specifically purchases the illusion of absolute control. The staging must reflect that overarching aspiration. Raw, uncalculated vulnerability does not sell luxury. It simply sells chaos." David tilted his head, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair. He tapped a crystal tumbler of iced sparkling water against the polished wood, considering Harper's rapid, flawless pivot. "Harper is correct regarding the brand identity," David finally agreed, nodding slowly toward the digital projection on the massive flat screen. "The client requires the aesthetic to remain aspirational and fundamentally untouchable. The slight rigidity in the posture actually emphasizes the structure of the garment. It creates a distinct barrier between the subject and the consumer. It works entirely for the campaign brief." Quinn did not argue. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. A slow, knowing smirk played at the corner of her mouth. She watched Harper with an expression of deep, infuriating amusement, entirely recognizing the labyrinth of corporate buzzwords Harper had just expertly constructed to deflect the reality of what had happened in the desert. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in aggressive compartmentalization. Harper stood at the head of the table, advancing through the slide deck, systematically breaking down the color grading, the shadow ratios, and the typographic overlay requirements for the final deliverables. She utilized her precise, elevated vocabulary as a defensive weapon, building an impenetrable fortress of professionalism around herself. She did not look at Quinn again. She kept her gaze fixed strictly on the executives, the screen, and the meticulous notes printed in her leather binder. "Excellent work, Harper." "Truly," David said, checking the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist. He stood up, buttoning his tailored Italian suit jacket. "The visual direction is completely locked. I want the final high-resolution edits uploaded to the agency server by Thursday afternoon for final client review. They will be formatted and delivered on schedule," Harper confirmed smoothly, snapping her leather binder shut. David walked around the long table and extended his hand to Quinn. "Thank you for navigating the weather conditions, Miss Gallagher. Your reputation for handling difficult locations is clearly well earned. The raw lighting is phenomenal." "Just doing the job, David," Quinn replied. She stood up, shaking the creative director's hand with a firm, practiced grip. The corporate machinery immediately began to dismantle the meeting. Chairs were pushed back, crystal tumblers were gathered, and the executives filtered out of the room in a chorus of hushed conversations and vibrating smartphones. Harper remained at the presentation console, purposefully busying herself with her silver laptop. She unplugged cables, coiled them with unnecessary precision, and packed them away. She needed the room to empty. She needed to escape the heavy, oppressive gravity that Quinn seemed to generate simply by existing in the same enclosed space. The ambient noise of the hallway slowly faded as the last executive exited. Harper reached for the handle of her briefcase. A heavy, definitive click echoed sharply through the expansive room. Harper froze. She looked up. Quinn had not left. She stood by the entrance of the boardroom. Her hand was resting firmly against the stainless steel handle of the heavy glass door. She had pushed it completely shut, engaging the magnetic lock. The dull hum of the agency bullpen outside was instantly severed, leaving the boardroom entirely silent except for the low, aggressive rush of the central air conditioning. The public space had just become distinctly, dangerously private. "The presentation is concluded, Quinn," Harper said, her voice dropping to a low, warning register. She kept her hands anchored flat on the surface of the mahogany table. "You can leave the hard drive on the console. I need to review the files with the retouching department." Quinn did not answer. She released the door handle and slowly turned around. The harsh, fluorescent overhead lighting caught the sharp angle of her jaw and the faint, pale scar near her collarbone, exposed by the unbuttoned collar of her black shirt. She began to walk down the length of the long wooden table. She did not rush. Her pacing was slow, deliberate, and entirely predatory. She dragged the tips of her fingers lightly along the highly polished mahogany surface as she moved, creating a faint, continuous whispering sound that set every single nerve in Harper's body on fire. "You are exceptional at that," Quinn murmured, her voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. "At what?" Harper snapped, her spine stiffening into a rigid, defensive line. "Building walls," Quinn clarified. She reached the end of the table and stepped around the final leather chair, entering Harper's immediate physical space. Using those massive, sterile corporate words to wrap a tourniquet around a situation you can't actually control. The illusion of absolute control. That was a brilliant line, Vance. David practically ate out of the palm of your hand. I was accurately describing the required visual aesthetic of the campaign brief. Harper defended herself, her voice tight. She grabbed the handle of her leather briefcase, preparing to step around Quinn and walk directly toward the locked door. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a substantial amount of actual work to finalize. Harper took a decisive step forward. Quinn instantly mirrored the movement, shifting her weight and completely blocking the narrow pathway between the presentation console and the edge of the mahogany table. Harper stopped abruptly. The toes of her leather pumps were mere inches from the scuffed tips of Quinn's vintage boots. I wasn't talking about the silk, Quinn said softly. Move out of my way, Quinn. You stopped breathing in the truck. The words hit Harper like a physical blow to the sternum. The icy air conditioning suddenly felt entirely inadequate. The memory of the dust storm, the blinding brown haze, the suffocating heat of the sealed cab, the desperate, unyielding grip she had on the cotton of Quinn's shirt, rushed back with violent, devastating clarity. I was experiencing a momentary, acute reaction to a claustrophobic environment, Harper stated, her voice shaking by a microscopic fraction. She fiercely tightened her grip on her briefcase. It was a severe localized weather event. It had absolutely nothing to do with you. Quinn laughed. It was a low, harsh sound, entirely devoid of humor. You are an incredible liar, Harper. You lie to the executives, you lie to the client, and you constantly lie to yourself. But you are a terrible liar when you are backed into a corner. Quinn took another step forward. Harper instinctively stepped back, but her spine instantly hit the hard, unforgiving edge of the presentation console. There was nowhere left to retreat. The polished mahogany table was on her left, the glass wall overlooking the Hollywood Hills was on her right, and Quinn was directly in front of her, a solid, immovable barrier blocking the only exit. We are standing inside a glass room, Harper hissed, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. She glanced frantically over Quinn's shoulder toward the transparent walls that separated the boardroom from the main hallway. Anyone in this entire agency can see us. They can see two colleagues discussing a project, Quinn countered, her voice dropping into a register that vibrated straight through Harper's chest. They cannot hear what we are saying. And they certainly cannot feel what is happening right now. Quinn reached out. She did not touch Harper's skin. Instead, her long fingers brushed against the sharp lapel of Harper's navy silk blouse. She traced the edge of the fabric with an agonizingly slow, deliberate motion, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle near Harper's collarbone. The heat radiating from Quinn's hand completely bypassed the expensive silk, searing directly into Harper's skin. Harper's breath hitched audibly. Her heart slammed against her ribs with a frantic, out-of-control rhythm. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, fighting a desperate, terrifying urge to lean forward into the touch. Tell me to back away, Quinn challenged softly. Her hand stopped moving, her knuckles resting heavily against Harper's chest, exactly over the erratic beating of her heart. Look me directly in the eyes, Vance, and tell me that you felt absolutely nothing in that desert. Tell me to walk out of this room, and I swear to you, I will never cross that line again. The silence in the freezing boardroom was absolute. Harper opened her eyes. Quinn was leaning in, the physical space between them compressed to less than an inch. The sharp, intoxicating scent of cedarwood, dark espresso, and the lingering, metallic tang of the desert storm entirely overwhelmed Harper's senses. Harper opened her mouth to issue the command. She needed to tell Quinn to leave. She needed to rebuild the shattered boundaries, to enforce the strict professional hierarchy, to permanently sever this dangerous, pulling tether before it completely destroyed her meticulously ordered life. But looking into the dark, unwavering intensity of Quinn's hazel eyes, the lie simply refused to materialize. The words caught in her throat, choking her. Her grip on the leather briefcase loosened, her knuckles losing their stark white tension. She could not say it. She could not command Quinn to step away, because a massive, terrifying part of her desperately wanted the exact opposite. Quinn watched the internal war wage across Harper's face. She felt the erratic, racing pulse beneath her knuckles. A slow, triumphant darkness settled into Quinn's eyes. She understood the silence perfectly. It was a complete surrender, heavily masked as an impasse. Quinn slowly pulled her hand away from Harper's chest, breaking the agonizing contact. She took a half step backward, giving Harper a fraction of the oxygen she desperately needed. Without breaking eye contact, Quinn reached behind her and blindly grabbed the silver hard drive still plugged into the presentation console. She pulled the cord free. Quinn reached out again, taking Harper's left hand. Harper did not resist. Quinn turned Harper's hand over and pressed the cold, metal casing of the hard drive directly into her palm. As she transferred the device, Quinn deliberately dragged her calloused thumb across the sensitive inner wrist of Harper's hand. Harper shivered violently, a full-body tremor that she could not suppress or disguise. "Thursday, Vance," Quinn murmured, her voice a low, gravelly promise that echoed in the quiet space. She slowly folded Harper's stiff fingers over the silver drive, trapping the metal inside her fist. "Let's see exactly how long you can hold your breath until then." Quinn did not wait for a response. She turned around, her heavy boots clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She walked toward the entrance, pulled the heavy glass door open, and stepped out into the bright, chaotic noise of the agency hallway. The magnetic lock engaged behind her, sealing the boardroom once again. Harper stood completely alone in the freezing room. She stared down at the small silver hard drive practically burning a hole through her palm. The absolute control she had spent her entire career perfecting had just been entirely dismantled, and as she stood trembling in the sterile corporate silence, she knew with terrifying certainty that there was no going back. Thursday arrived with the suffocating weight of an impending execution. The digital clock in the lower right corner of Harper's dual-monitor setup flipped to 8:42 p.m. The sprawling layout of the West Hollywood agency outside her private office was entirely dark. The creative teams had abandoned their ergonomic workstations hours ago, leaving behind a sterile graveyard of glowing standby screens and half-empty cold brew cups. The centralized air conditioning had automatically switched to its low-power evening cycle, allowing a heavy, stagnant warmth to settle over the fourth floor. Harper sat rigidly in her high-backed leather executive chair. She wore a tailored charcoal pencil skirt and a stark white silk blouse, the cuffs impeccably fastened with heavy silver links. She had spent the last 84 hours operating in a state of calculated, ruthless efficiency. She had dismantled the campaign timeline, micromanaged the retouching department, and buried herself under an avalanche of logistics. She did everything humanly possible to surgically extract the memory of the desert dust storm from her nervous system. It was a complete failure. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the rough texture of a vintage cotton t-shirt beneath her knuckles. Every time the office air conditioning kicked on, she smelled dry cedarwood. Harper stared at the high-resolution files queued on her primary monitor. The campaign was flawless. The lighting was exactly what the client requested. She rested her manicured finger on the trackpad, the cursor hovering directly over the final digital upload and share button. One click, and the project would be transferred to the client's secure server. One click, and her professional obligation to Quinn Gallagher would be permanently terminated. She pressed down. Before the mechanical click could fully register, the heavy, frosted glass door of her private office swung open without a single knock. Harper's hand jerked away from the trackpad. Her heart executed a violent, erratic stutter against her ribs. Quinn stood in the doorway. She was practically swallowed by the dim shadows of the corridor, illuminated only by the harsh, blue glow of Harper's computer monitors. She wore a faded black denim jacket over a thin white-ribbed tank top, and a pair of heavily scuffed combat boots that made absolutely no sound against the thick corporate carpeting. She carried a large, flat black presentation box tucked casually under her left arm. The security desk in the lobby has surprisingly lax standards after 8 o'clock, Quinn noted. Her voice was low and rough, slicing through the agonizing silence of the empty office. She stepped inside, letting the heavy glass door swing shut behind her. The magnetic lock engaged with a definitive, echoing click. "You do not have clearance to be on this floor after business hours," Harper stated. She hated how breathless she suddenly sounded. She immediately straightened her spine, gripping the edge of her glass desk with both hands. "I'm delivering the physical archival prints," Quinn said, gesturing lazily to the black box. She did not stop near the door. She walked directly toward Harper's desk, navigating the minimalist furniture with that same infuriating, predatory grace. Contractual obligation. Had to hand them over before the Thursday deadline officially expired. "You could have left them with the downstairs concierge." "I could have," Quinn agreed. She reached the edge of the massive glass desk. She didn't drop the box. She gently slid it across the smooth, transparent surface until it rested exactly over Harper's keyboard, effectively blocking her access to the computer. "But I wanted to see if you were still holding your breath." The memory of Quinn's final threat in the boardroom flared violently in Harper's mind. The air in the private office suddenly felt incredibly thin. Harper stood up abruptly, pushing her leather chair back. The physical barrier of the desk was substantial, yet it offered absolutely no real protection against the heavy, undeniable gravity radiating from the photographer. "The files are approved. The client transfer is initiating," Harper said, her voice vibrating with a dangerous, brittle tension. She looked down at the black presentation box, stubbornly refusing to meet Quinn's eyes. "Our professional transaction is officially complete. You can leave now. Look at me, Vance. I have nothing further to discuss with you. Look at me." The command was soft, but it carried an absolute, unyielding weight. Harper squeezed her eyes shut for a microscopic second, fighting a desperate, losing battle against her own biology. Slowly, she lifted her chin. Quinn's hazel eyes were incredibly dark, reflecting the cool blue light of the monitors. She wasn't smirking. The casual, arrogant armor she usually wore was completely stripped away, leaving behind a raw, intense hunger that mirrored the exact expression Harper had been hiding since Palm Springs. Quinn reached out, placing both of her palms flat against the edge of the glass desk. She leaned her weight forward. "You've been hiding in this glass cage for 4 days, Quinn murmured, her gaze tracking the erratic pulse beating wildly at the base of Harper's throat. "You approved the edits through your assistant. You cancelled the mandatory final review call. You built a fortress of emails and proxies just to avoid being in the same room as me. I am an art director managing multiple high-level accounts," Harper countered defensively. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the edge of her desk. "I do not have the luxury of time." "You are terrified," Quinn corrected gently. She took a slow step around the corner of the desk, breaching the boundary of Harper's private workspace. "Because you know exactly what happens the second we are alone without an audience." Harper instinctively took a half step backward, but her spine immediately hit the cold, hard edge of a tall filing cabinet. She was trapped. Quinn closed the remaining distance. She stopped less than 6 inches away. The scent of cedarwood, dark espresso, and the sharp, metallic cold of the Los Angeles night completely enveloped Harper's senses. In the dim lighting, the faint scar on Quinn's collarbone was starkly visible above the neckline of her tank top. "You crossed a professional line in the desert," Harper whispered, her voice a ragged, failing instrument. She kept her hands anchored to her sides, physically restraining herself from reaching out. "You are reckless. You lack discipline. You are a chaotic element. And you are entirely suffocating under all this discipline, Harper," Quinn replied softly. She reached up. Harper stopped breathing. Quinn's long fingers brushed lightly against the collar of Harper's pristine white silk blouse. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violent tension humming in the air between them. Quinn's knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of Harper's neck. A full-body shiver wrecked through Harper's frame, completely shattering her rigid posture. "You are trying so hard to keep the armor perfectly polished," Quinn whispered, her thumb tracing the sharp line of Harper's jaw. She tilted her head, leaning in until her lips were a fraction of an inch from Harper's ear. "But you're shaking, Vance. You are completely falling apart." The absolute truth of the statement hit Harper like a physical strike to the chest. She was falling apart. She had been falling apart since the moment Quinn forced her to sit on that emerald velvet couch. The endless spreadsheets, the corporate jargon, the immaculate silk blouses, they were all useless, pathetic shields against the overwhelming, terrifying desire currently consuming her blood. Harper looked at the intense, dark focus in Quinn's eyes. She looked at Quinn's mouth. The desperate, primal urge she had fought in the sweltering cab of the Ford Bronco roared back to life, instantly obliterating every single rational thought she possessed. The control snapped. It didn't fray or bend, it shattered completely into 1,000 jagged pieces. Harper moved. She didn't step back. She didn't issue a command. She reached forward with both hands, her manicured fingers grabbing the heavy denim lapels of Quinn's black jacket. With a sudden, fierce burst of strength, Harper pulled Quinn hard against her. Quinn let out a low, breathless gasp as their bodies collided. Before she could recover, Harper tilted her chin up and closed the final, agonizing distance. The impact of their lips was not gentle. It was a desperate, urgent collision, fueled by 84 hours of repressed anxiety and absolute starvation. Harper pressed upward, her mouth hot and demanding against Quinn's. It was a reckless surrender, a total abandonment of the meticulously ordered universe she had spent her entire life ruling. Quinn reacted instantly. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a ruthless, answering hunger. Her arms wrapped fiercely around Harper's waist, hauling her flush against her body. The heavy metal buckle of Quinn's belt pressed painfully, perfectly against Harper's stomach. Quinn angled her head, deepening the kiss, her tongue tracing the seam of Harper's lips before pushing past them with a possessive, breathtaking heat. Harper groaned softly, a sound she had never made in her life, the sound vibrating directly into Quinn's mouth. She let go of the denim jacket, sliding her hands up to fiercely tangle her fingers into the thick, messy waves of Quinn's dark hair. She pulled sharply, anchoring Quinn closer, terrified that if she let go for even a single second, the photographer would vanish into thin air. Quinn backed Harper up forcefully. Harper's spine hit the edge of the glass desk with a heavy thud, rattling the monitors and the black presentation box. Quinn didn't stop. She pressed her entire weight against Harper, pinning her completely against the desk, her hands sliding up from Harper's waist to fiercely grip the sides of her ribcage. The physical pressure was overwhelming, a grounding anchor in the chaotic storm of sensory overload. The contrast was absolute. The agency was a monument to sterile corporate efficiency, but in the narrow space between the edge of the desk and the filing cabinet, the temperature was a suffocating, blinding heat. The frantic rustle of starched silk sliding against rough denim echoed like a chaotic symphony. Harper's meticulous control over her environment, her schedule, and her very breathing, had been completely hijacked by the aggressive, unyielding pressure of Quinn's mouth. Quinn pulled back a fraction of an inch, just enough to draw in a ragged, desperate breath. Her hazel eyes were blown completely dark, her lips swollen and damp. She rested her forehead heavily against Harper's, her chest heaving violently against Harper's own racing heart. "Tell me this is a technical mistake," Quinn rasped, her voice a rough, broken whisper against Harper's skin. Her thumb swept fiercely across Harper's flushed cheekbone. "Look me in the eyes and tell me this is a meaningless artifact." Harper's hands were still locked tightly in the hair at the nape of Quinn's neck. She was trembling uncontrollably, stripped bare of every corporate defense, every icy glare, and every single excuse. She looked at the woman who had effortlessly dismantled her entire world. "Shut up," Harper breathed out. She didn't rebuild the wall. Instead, Harper tightened her grip on Quinn's hair and pulled her back down, crushing their lips together again, completely and utterly willingly surrendering to the absolute chaos. The collision of their mouths was a violent, absolute erasure of the past 96 hours. The sterile, highly regulated environment of the West Hollywood agency completely dissolved, leaving nothing but the suffocating heat radiating between them and the unforgiving edge of the glass desk biting into Harper's spine. Harper clung to the thick denim of Quinn's jacket, her knuckles aching from the sheer force of her grip. She was kissing Quinn with a desperate, starving intensity that terrified her. It was entirely uncalculated. There were no mood boards, no campaign strategies, and no safety nets. There was only the raw, electric friction of Quinn's mouth opening against hers, the possessive weight of Quinn's hands anchoring her hips, and the chaotic, overlapping rhythm of their ragged breathing. Quinn shifted her stance, stepping directly between Harper's knees, eliminating the final microscopic fraction of space separating them. The movement forced Harper to tilt her head further back, exposing the long, sensitive line of her throat. Quinn immediately broke the kiss, her lips trailing fiercely down Harper's jawline. Harper let out a sharp, fractured gasp as Quinn's mouth pressed against the racing pulse at the base of her neck. The sensation was a blinding flash of pure static electricity. Her hands slid from the denim collar, her manicured fingers tangling frantically in the messy, thick waves of Quinn's dark hair, pressing the photographer closer. "Quinn," Harper breathed out. The single syllable was a wreck, completely stripped of its usual commanding authority. It was a plea. Quinn dragged her teeth lightly against Harper's collarbone, entirely ignoring the expensive, starched silk of the pristine blouse. She moved back up, capturing Harper's lips once again in a slow, devastatingly thorough kiss that tasted of dark espresso and complete surrender. Harper felt the hard metal buckle of Quinn's belt pressing flush against her stomach, a grounding, physical anchor in a room that suddenly felt like it was spinning wildly off its axis. A sharp, Cheerful electronic chimes suddenly echoed through the silent office. Ping! The blue light from the dual monitors flared brightly against the dark walls. A sterile dialog box popped up on the primary screen directly behind them. Client upload complete. Transfer successful. The cheerful corporate sound was a bucket of freezing water. It violently pierced the isolated, primal bubble they had constructed in the dark. Harper's eyes snapped open. The reality of her location, her executive office, the glass walls, the agency floor, crashed back into her consciousness with the subtle force of a freight train. She immediately released her fierce grip on Quinn's hair, her hands dropping to plant flat against Quinn's chest. She pushed. Quinn did not stumble this time. She stepped back slowly, her hands sliding deliberately down the sides of Harper's ribcage, her fingertips catching on the hem of the white silk blouse before finally breaking contact. The physical separation was jarring. The sudden absence of Quinn's heavy, radiating heat left Harper feeling instantly cold and entirely exposed. Harper gripped the edge of the glass desk, her chest heaving violently. She stared at Quinn. In the harsh blue glow of the monitors, the evidence of their collision was undeniable. Quinn's lips were dark and swollen, her chest rising and falling in a rapid, uneven cadence. Her dark hair, which Harper had just ruthlessly dragged her fingers through, stood in chaotic, unruly waves. "The files," Harper whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. She turned her head, staring blindly at the glowing dialog box on the screen. "The upload is finished." "I know," Quinn rasped. Her voice was incredibly low, vibrating with a raw, lingering tension. She did not look at the computer. She kept her hazel eyes locked entirely on Harper's flushed face. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly interrupted by a dull, rhythmic sound echoing from the distant corridor outside the glass office. The metallic jingle of heavy keys. Harper froze. Her heart executed a violent stutter against her ribs. The night security patrol. They were conducting the 9 o'clock sweep of the executive floor. The pure, unfiltered panic finally managed to completely override the residual haze of adrenaline. Harper turned away from Quinn, her hands moving in a frantic, disjointed blur. She desperately smoothed down the front of her charcoal pencil skirt. She reached for the collar of her white silk blouse, her trembling fingers attempting to button the top clasp, completely failing to align the delicate fabric. Her hair, usually secured in a flawless, immaculate French twist, was partially undone, several dark strands falling loosely against her cheek. She was visibly, undeniably unraveling. Quinn watched the frantic reconstruction for exactly 3 seconds before she reached out. She gently caught Harper's violently trembling wrists, forcing her hands to stop moving. Harper flinched, her eyes darting toward the frosted glass door. The rhythmic jingle of the security keys was growing steadily louder, echoing against the polished concrete floors of the bullpen. "Stop," Quinn commanded softly. She didn't let go of Harper's wrists. "Breathe, Vance. The security guard is in the main corridor," Harper hissed, her voice a tight, breathless whisper of sheer panic. "If he sees you in here, if he sees. He's not going to see anything." Quinn released Harper's wrists. With slow, infuriatingly calm precision, Quinn reached up and tucked the loose strands of hair behind Harper's ear. Her knuckles grazed the hot, flushed skin of Harper's cheek. "Your armor is dented. But you are still entirely in charge. Grab your things." The quiet, unyielding certainty in Quinn's voice acted as a temporary anchor. Harper forced herself to take a deep, jagged breath. She grabbed her silver laptop, slamming it shut. She shoved it into her leather briefcase, entirely ignoring the meticulous organization she usually maintained. She grabbed her metallic clutch, her fingers wrapping around the handle with a death grip. Quinn picked up the flat black presentation box from the glass desk. She stepped back, giving Harper a clear path to the door. Harper walked quickly, practically fleeing the scene of the crime. She pulled the heavy frosted glass door open and stepped out into the dimly lit, expansive agency floor. The security guard was at the far opposite end of the bullpen, shining a yellow flashlight into the retouching department. Harper did not look back. She walked briskly toward the elevator bank, her heels clicking in a fast, sharp cadence against the floor. Quinn followed silently, her heavy combat boots making absolutely no sound. Harper hit the stainless steel down button with unnecessary force. The LED display above the doors flickered, indicating the car was descending from the penthouse level. The weight was agonizing. The massive, empty floor felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen directly out of Harper's lungs. The heavy steel doors finally slid open with a muted chime. Harper stepped inside, retreating immediately to the back right corner of the car. The elevator was entirely lined with mirrored panels, creating a dizzying, infinite reflection of the small space. Quinn stepped in. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside a descending metal box. The mechanical hum of the elevator dropping was the only sound. Harper stared rigidly at the brushed steel numbers changing on the digital display above the door. 4. 3. She made the devastating mistake of glancing at the mirrored wall to her left. The reflection was merciless. It showed Harper Vance, the untouchable art director, pressed defensively into the corner, her silk blouse wrinkled, her lips visibly swollen, her entire posture radiating a chaotic, vibrating tension. And standing less than 2 feet away was Quinn, holding the black archival box, watching Harper's reflection with an expression of dark, unwavering intensity. Quinn shifted her weight. She took a single, slow step to the side, closing the physical gap between them in the confined space. Harper stiffened, her spine pressing flat against the cold mirror. Quinn. Do not. Quinn ignored the command entirely. She didn't trap Harper against the wall, but she stood close enough that the sleeve of her denim jacket brushed against the bare skin of Harper's forearm. In the dead silence of the descending elevator, the microscopic contact felt as loud as a gunshot. You can fix your blouse, Harper, Quinn murmured, her eyes locked on Harper's reflection in the glass. You can march back into that boardroom tomorrow and pretend you are made entirely of ice. But you can never tell me that what just happened was a mistake. The elevator chimed. Level P2. Underground parking. The doors slid open, revealing the damp, concrete expanse of the agency's subterranean garage. The harsh fluorescent tube lights buzzed loudly overhead. Harper practically bolted out of the elevator. She needed open air. She needed her car. She walked rapidly toward the VIP parking section, the frantic clicking of her heels echoing loudly against the concrete pillars. She reached the designated spot, digging into her metallic clutch for her keys. Her fingers closed around the cold metal fob just as she registered the empty space. Her sleek black Audi was not there. Harper froze, staring blankly at the oil-stained concrete. The rational part of her brain desperately attempted to reboot. She had brought the car to the dealership for routine servicing that morning. She had taken an upscale rideshare to the agency. She was currently stranded on level P2 at 9:30 at night. Looking for this. Harper turned around. Quinn was standing beside the restored 1978 Ford Bronco, parked haphazardly across two standard spaces near the concrete exit ramp. Quinn tossed a set of heavy brass keys in the air, catching them effortlessly. "I took a car service this morning," Harper stated flatly, instantly reaching for her phone. "I will call another one. It's a Thursday night in West Hollywood. A black car is going to take 45 minutes to get down into this bunker," Quinn pointed out practically. She walked over to the Bronco and pulled the heavy passenger door open. The metallic creak echoed loudly in the empty garage. "Get in, Vance. I'm taking you home." Harper stared at the high cab of the dark truck. The last time she had been trapped inside that vehicle, they were engulfed in a violent desert dust storm, and she had nearly lost her mind. The thought of getting back into that narrow space with Quinn, directly after what had just occurred on her glass desk, was professional suicide. But looking at Quinn, standing by the open door with that quiet, unyielding patience, Harper realized the professional suicide had already occurred. Without a word, Harper walked forward. She climbed up into the heavy cab, her charcoal skirt pulling tight against her thighs. She dropped her briefcase onto the floorboards and pulled the canvas seatbelt across her chest. Quinn shut the door, walked around the front of the truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. She tossed the black presentation box onto the back seat and turned the key. The heavy engine roared to life, a deep, guttural vibration that instantly transferred through the floorboards and settled heavily at the base of Harper's spine. Quinn shifted into first gear and steered the Bronco up the concrete ramp, emerging onto the dark, neon-lit streets of West Hollywood. The drive was the absolute antithesis of the Interstate 10 nightmare. The brutal desert sun was replaced by the cool, damp marine layer of the Los Angeles night. The suffocating, howling wind was gone, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic hum of the heavy tires rolling across the asphalt of Santa Monica Boulevard. The streetlights flickered rhythmically across the windshield, casting shifting, amber shadows inside the dark cab. Harper kept her body angled slightly toward the window, watching the blur of closed storefronts and neon signs. The silence in the truck was heavy, but it was no longer hostile. It was charged. It was completely saturated with the undeniable, lingering memory of the kiss. Every time Quinn had to stop at a red light, the low rumble of the idling engine vibrated through the seats. Harper's pulse synchronized with it, a steady, rhythmic thrumming in her veins. As they approached a long stretch of traffic near Beverly Hills, Quinn reached down to shift the heavy metal gear stick. It was the exact same motion that had tortured Harper in the desert. Quinn's hand grasped the worn leather knob. As she pushed the stick forward into third gear, the side of her hand deliberately brushed against the side of Harper's knee. Harper's breath hitched in the quiet cab. The localized heat of Quinn's knuckles against her skin was a sudden, violent spark. In the desert, Harper had completely locked up, pressing herself against the passenger door in a desperate attempt to escape the contact. Now, sitting in the cool dark of the LA night, Harper did not move away. She stared straight ahead at the red taillights of the car in front of them. Her heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. Slowly, moving with a deliberate, agonizing precision, Harper lifted her left hand from her lap. She moved her hand across the non-existent center console. She did not push Quinn's hand away. Harper gently rested her palm directly over the back of Quinn's hand, effectively trapping Quinn's fingers against the gear stick. The heavy Ford Bronco swerved by a microscopic fraction of an inch as Quinn's grip on the steering wheel instantly tightened. Quinn let out a low, ragged exhale that sounded incredibly loud over the engine noise. She did not pull her hand out from under Harper's. Instead, Quinn slowly turned her hand over, intertwining her long, calloused fingers perfectly with Harper's trembling ones. Quinn's thumb began to stroke the sensitive skin on the back of Harper's hand, a slow, continuous, devastatingly gentle motion that completely dismantled the remaining fragments of Harper's armor. They drove the remaining 4 miles in absolute silence, their hands locked fiercely together over the transmission tunnel. Quinn finally pulled the heavy truck onto the circular driveway of Harper's upscale, modern high-rise in Century City. The tires crunched softly against the decorative gravel. Quinn killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. Harper did not immediately let go of Quinn's hand. She sat frozen, staring out the windshield at the polished glass entrance of her building. The realization of what she had just surrendered was staggering. Slowly, Harper turned her head. Quinn was already looking at her, the dark hazel eyes completely entirely unreadable in the dim light. "I need to go," Harper whispered. Her voice was incredibly fragile. "I know," Quinn replied softly. Quinn let go of Harper's hand. The loss of contact felt like a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. But before Harper could reach for the door handle, Quinn reached up, her fingers sliding gently into the hair at the nape of Harper's neck. Quinn leaned across the narrow space. It wasn't the violent, starving collision of the office. It was a slow, deliberate claiming. Quinn's lips brushed softly against Harper's, a lingering, achingly sweet pressure that demanded absolutely nothing but offered everything. Harper's eyes fluttered shut, leaning into the soft touch for one perfect, suspended second, before she finally pulled away. She grabbed her briefcase, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out into the cool night air. She did not look back as she walked toward the glowing lobby doors, but she felt the heavy weight of Quinn's gaze tracking every single step. The professional war was officially over,